Good evening. We're in Romans 13 tonight. Uh, kind of a weird passage of the Bible in a lot of ways. Christians were under Roman rule. This book was written to Rome, so they were right in the middle of that rule. Roman law wasn't always so great for people who were not Romans, Christians, Jews. Sometimes conflicted with Roman law. So, that was a point of contention. Taxes. Most Jews didn't want to pay taxes to the Romans. That was a big point of contention when they went to see Jesus and said, why are you paying this tax? And render unto Caesar what's Caesar's, unto God what's God. That was one of those conversations. They were trying to trick him. We shouldn't have to pay taxes because we're Jews and this is Jerusalem and this is our hometown. The Romans are more or less the invaders here. Why are we paying them tax? And so, there was a Jewish government and there was a Roman government, right? I mean, there was a Jewish government. The Sanhedrin was the Jewish high court. There was the Sanhedrin that was the Roman government. There were Roman soldiers, the Templar soldiers, the Roman guard, the temple guard. So they had their own system of government. They had their own system of law. And, if you violated that, they could prosecute you for that. They could put you in prison for that. They couldn't kill you for that. That's what we've seen at the time of Christ. But other than that, they could pretty well do what they wanted to do. So they could do all those things to you if they chose to. But on the other hand, there was Roman law. Roman law, proconsuls, government, taxation was severe under Caesar. Rome depended on taxation for everything that they did. Taxation was real severe. Tax collectors were hated. People wanted to know why they had to pay tax to Rome that was so far away and what Rome did for them. And same things you hear today, right? Isn't any different. So, but it was worse there. It was the taxation was more severe. And then Christians came along in the middle of all this mix, and their king is Christ, and that's their king, and that's who they're supposed to serve. And yet they're in this Roman world, and yet then the Jews are on the other hand. They're sitting this Jewish influence. So there's a lot of different things going on, and I think when you read this passage, oftentimes we use this a lot. We really use it when governments, people get elected that we don't want to get elected. God sets all rulers, and we kind of rely on that passage, right? But there were some terrible rulers, terrible, right? I mean, even under Domitian and Nero killed all the Christians. Nero rode by the light of burning Christians in his garden. I mean, he was awful. Murdered millions, put them in the lion's den. Burned them alive, burned them at the stake, skinned them alive, cut their heads off. I mean, awful, right? I mean, it was just awful. Christians were, especially by the time that John was banished to Patmos, Christians were despised. They blamed Christians for Rome burning. Christians were despised. Christians had no representation, no place to run. So, I mean, this wasn't necessarily the case when Paul wrote this. It was in a little better place when Paul wrote this. But it's going to get so much worse. And then there's always the conflict. What if government interferes with our Christian freedoms? So there's always, it's kind of a really hard passage. And we kind of got to ask ourselves, I think you have to ask yourself when you read this, hopefully I won't get myself in trouble here. I think you have to ask yourself when you read this, is Paul talking about all time? Or is Paul talking about that time? And I think that's kind of an important question to answer when we start talking about this particular passage. I think there's things in this passage that allude to the idea that Paul's more talking about that particular time in history, not maybe all of history, but maybe more of that particular time. But there could be arguments made both ways, I guess. But Paul basically says in this, he says, every person be subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. So Paul's basic premise is is that if leaders are established by God, to serve them is a godly thing to do. Now, that being said, it's kind of a hard deal because we've all known leaders that are very, very ungodly leaders, right? I mean, Hitler is a good example of that, right? Mussolini, right? I mean, if you go back into the emperors, a whole lot of them were really, really bad. There's people today that are really, really bad, right? There's leaders in Afghanistan now that are, there's leaders all over the world that are evil. Um, well, not at this time, though. That's kind of the thing, right? This is a different time in history. Yeah, at this particular time when this is written, the temple's still standing, Jerusalem still exists, the Jews still have a government in Jerusalem. The Romans are involved, but the Romans aren't persecuting the Jews. The Jews, are existing under Roman rule. Christians are kind of under the radar. Nobody's really messing with them. They're not really worth messing with at this particular time in history. They're not the majority. They're just kind of there, not having to mess with them. We really haven't got into that persecution that's going to come later on by the time John's on Patmos and things are deteriorating. So that's what I mean. It's a very unique time in history, and that's one thing I was said before you got in here is that, something I think you really have to ask yourself when you look at this, was Paul talking about all time? Was he talking about all of history? Or was he talking specifically to this group of people and saying, this is where we're at right now? Well, I think it's a passage we use a lot. There's comfort in it to think that God sets all rulers, in regards to how bad they are, that God's in control of it, which God is in control of things, But on the other hand, I think you kind of got to consider, how this is going to get so much worse for Christians, and how other things are going to occur. To be subject to a government, can that government to be subject to a government, can that put you at odds with Christianity, at odds with God? Can government do things legally that aren't, as a Christian, we could never do? You see what I'm saying? The government can say things are legal. Does it make it right? Are we subject to that? If the government law goes against what we are as Christians, where do you draw that? Where do we draw that line? Um, abortion's a great example, I think, of that, right? Abortion's legal, right? It's a legal thing to do. Is it a right thing to do, right? Um, right, right. Yeah, so I mean, but then again, Peter 2 times in Acts, he went against what the government said, right? The government said, don't preach the gospel, and Peter said, who am I to serve, right? You or God, right? And then another time in Acts, it was the same thing. Peter directly went against what the government told him to do. So, But I think when man's law directly contradicts God's law, God's law is going to reign. It has to reign in the life of a Christian. A Christian can't say, well, I'm not going to. If the government said you can't worship, which a lot of governments in the world say that, as Christians, you can't. It's illegal for you to worship. You can't assemble. It's illegal to own a Bible. 31 countries in the world right now, it's illegal to own a Bible. If you were in one of those countries, would you worship? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right. A lot of it though goes along with the idea. I think a lot of what Paul's saying in context is don't go against the government just because you think you're a Christian and I don't have to do that. You're not my government. You're not my king. You're not my emperor. Nobody's king but Christ. You can't. Emperors, you got to remember, under Roman rule, the emperor considered himself a god, right? I mean, the emperor considered himself a god. He considered he was divinely set. Kings in England, they considered themselves divinely appointed by God to rule. So they considered themselves as a divine entity. So as a Christian, under Roman rule, to say, I submit to Caesar, that kind of went against a lot of values. And later on, what a lot of the persecution that existed with John is that to be a Roman and to be a Roman citizen, to be protected under Rome, you had to burn a pinch of incense and kiss the bust of a Caesar. Basically you had to proclaim them God. You had to give them worship. Christians refused to do that. And that's one reason and after they refused to do it, as far as Rome was concerned, they weren't Roman citizens anymore. They could do whatever they wanted to them. So they killed them. They took their property. They took their lands. They took their businesses. They did all kinds of things because Christians refused to say Caesar's a god. And we would do the same thing, right? I mean, if a government come along and said, well, you got to say your leader's a god, the president's a god, there's no way I would do that. I mean, you know what I'm saying? So I don't think that wasn't going on. That wasn't at this point. I don't think that was the deal that it's going to be later on. So I don't know. A lot of Christians died because they refused to do it. That's all I know to tell you. Well, that occurred, after this, years, 30 years after this. So I don't know. That's what I'm saying. It's hard to, when you read through it, it sounds real easy, but then when you really start to put it in context to what was going on and what was going to happen and what has happened, it becomes a lot more difficult to kind of reconcile. Never. He always wanted him to exist. Right. Yeah, Jesus never was against the government, never was against rule, even Roman rule. He never stood against that. He always wanted to exist within the system. Right. But then again, the system crucified him. So, you know what, so I mean, I don't know. It's a little more difficult than I think sometimes we see it on the surface. And like Jay said, a lot of times in the Old Testament where God's people went directly against commands of kings and rulers. Whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. And Paul really kind of puts these rulers kind of on a pedestal, and in Rome, and this is in Rome. So, and a lot of this time, these rulers were kind of fearful. I mean, they had a lot of authority, and no fear for authority. What you do is good; you will have praise from the same. So, basically, I think it really goes along on a broader context with kind of like what Brent's saying. Exist within the system, right? I mean, the system's corrupt, but exist within it to the best of your ability. Don't stand against it just to stand against it. Live a good life. Do the best you can. Don't resist authority. Um, but yeah, go ahead, Pat. Yeah, we definitely look towards that. But I think when you get a little bit further in the passage, Paul kind of alludes to the idea that things aren't going to go on for a long time, and I think that's one thing you kind of got to consider further in the text. So I think that and we'll get to that. For is it a minister of God to you for good? But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. The government, basically, here does not bear the sword for nothing. But is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. And that's something Jesus went along with that, right? Give to Caesar what Caesar's. Render to all what is due to them, tax to whom tax, custom to custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So I think what Paul's trying to tell them is, as much as it's in your ability, get along with it. Don't just buck authority just to buck authority. If it's good stuff, then you need to go along with it. You need to do what it says to do. But then once again, this is going to get so bad for them in just a little while. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For this, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. If there is any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is a fulfillment of the law. Do this, knowing the time that it is already the hour for you to awaken from sleep. For now salvation is nearer to you, nearer to us than when we believed. And I think that's one of those passages in the Bible that alludes to the idea that even the apostles believed this wasn't going to go on very long. This was not a long-term thing. I really believe with all my little heart that if you was to go back in that day and tell Paul and tell them apostles that 2,000 years later we were going to be having this conversation, they would have said we were crazy. I really believe that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I just don't believe they thought this was going to go on for 2,000 years. They just didn't. Like Jay says, just to read the scripture, there's things that are abundantly clear. And one of the things that's abundantly clear to me is they really expected Jesus in their lifetime, in that generation. They really did. No, it doesn't negate the Word of God, by no means. Right, but I think when you get to this verse, it kind of alludes the idea that Paul's saying, hang on for a little while. Well, yeah, we should still be thinking the same thing. It's coming quick. Yeah, Billy? Yeah, this is before that. This was before Christians really started getting persecuted. But Christians heeded these words, even under persecution. They died by the millions. Christians did not fight back. Christians stayed underneath that governmental authority, even though it was wrong. Well, even today, there's religious organizations within the United States that don't want to submit to governmental authority today, even today, right now. This minute, there's religious organizations in this country that don't want to submit to the government of the United States. So, I think, like you say, it's a long time ago. It's today. There's a lot of things going on. Yeah, Jack? Yeah, and that's right. There's a lot of real valuable ideas there. The idea that we as Christians, the best way for us as Christians to continue to exist is continue to exist within the bounds of law. And that's true. Right. No, I'm just saying that it's you can go to 1,000 different examples here. You can. It happens. This is still really prevalent today. Even in World War II, our wars were we were underneath the draft. people who are morally opposed to fighting in a war, and the government says, here you go, we're telling you got to go fight. Well, I like the Civil War. That's my best example. In the Civil War, where you're in the South or the North, and the government of that particular territory is telling you you need to go get a gun and you need to go shoot your neighbor, because that's what the government tells you to do. And even though they're a brother in Christ, that's irrelevant. The government says you got to pick up a gun and go to war. And so, what do? Do you go shoot a brother in Christ? Would you go shoot another Christian in a civil war? Do you think that would be the godly thing to do, the right thing to do? So who are you denying, right? Yeah, that's right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, religious leaders of the day were torn, right? Most of them were, Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone, both came out and said, we in no way would support you picking up arms against your brothers and sisters. So, go ahead, Ron. Yeah, I agree with that. Unlike an enemy like in World War II or a war like that, but in the Civil War, you were fighting the guy that was literally across the river from you. I mean, you knew that family. You knew those people. A little bit different war, than saying I'm going to go over to Germany and shoot a German, or shoot some of the Japanese, whatever, that I never met. I don't know anything about them. But in the Civil War, they're saying go take up a gun and shoot this guy over here that you might be related to him, right? You might have went to church with that guy. A little bit different situation. Hopefully, we'll never know. I'm just saying that it can be. There's a lot of situations, circumstances, and I think when you look at this, you really have to be thinking, you know, where do I fit in to all this? I think another interesting thing about this passage is when he talks about loving your neighbor, and he says love. I love this. All these Ten Commandment things he brings up in here about loving your neighbor, but the one thing that doesn't encompass is the Sabbath, right? Loving your neighbor has nothing to do with keeping the Sabbath, and that's kind of interesting. All them other laws are kind of person to person related, right? Or God to person. No other idols. Anyway, just a thought to throw out there. But do this. It's already the hour. So they thought it was coming really quickly. The night is almost gone. The day is near. Paul alludes to the idea this is quick. This isn't going to be a long time. This isn't going to be 1,000 years. I don't believe most of them thought it would be 50 years. I think most of them were literally expecting Jesus to come any day. So, like Buck says, we should still be looking for Jesus to come any day. But let's be realistic about it. It's been 2,000 years. Do you think, really, in your heart, do you think Jesus is coming in your lifetime today? Do you really believe that in your heart? Do you think Jesus will come in your lifetime? We're closer than yesterday, but I'm just asking the question, right? That's right. The end of the world's coming for me, yeah, before too many years. Yeah. Yeah. So you're right. Yeah. 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 That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So he says, put on the armor of light, behave properly as in the day. Once again, Paul gives us a list. He loves lists. Not in carousing, drunkenness, sexual promiscuity, and sensuality, and strife and jealousy. Put on the Lord Jesus Christ. Make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts. So Paul, once again, gives a list. Live in the light. Don't do these things. Once again, he calls those things out. And the reason he does, he says, now accept the one who's weak in the faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. Anybody want to elaborate on that a little bit before we get any further? What's it mean to be weak in the faith, do you think? What's Paul regard as weak in the faith? No, but he kind of is getting a little bit, maybe, a little bit, talks about the law, but I think in Paul's opinion, a weak in the faith brother, this is just, huh? I don't necessarily think new. I think Paul's opinion, as we really read this passage, of someone who's weak in the faith is someone that holds on to tradition and form more than love. And I think you can be a 40-year Christian and be weak in the faith. I'm like Brent. I think you can be a Christian for 50 years and be weak in the faith. I think if your faith is based on tradition and function and not love, then you're weak in the faith. Yeah, I believe that's exactly what Paul's talking about. Yeah, Jack. Yeah. Yeah, your attitude definitely changes. I'm sure by if I make it to 91, I'm sure my attitude will be a lot different than it is now. But I've already changed a lot in the course of my life, I promise you. I'm definitely not the same person I was 20 years ago. Ain't no doubt about it in a lot of ways. But yeah, as you get older, things look different. The world looks a little different when you're older than when you're younger, for sure. I think Paul would say, if you got people that are holding on to things so tight and they think those things are what makes them righteous or makes them justified, and you can't get past that, those are people who are really weak in the faith. Your faith has got to be able to look beyond. Many years ago, I left this church because I got offended. And, well, it was a little more than just that. It was my kids. And it was my family that did it. It was my own family that did it. So can't really blame anybody but my family. And we left. We quit coming many years ago. And I can honestly tell you, in that same situation today, I wouldn't have quit. I wouldn't quit. But maybe that's an example, I think as you mature and your faith becomes more about God than about everything else that's going on around me, and worship becomes more about being here to worship God and not being here and worrying about everybody else or what everybody else is thinking or what everybody else is doing or what somebody might have said to me, I think that's a mature Christian, because that's really what worship should be about. It's about looking towards God, not looking at each other so much. But I think when you're weak and you're holding on to things, then little things can be big things. I remember, some of y'all probably remember years ago when first time we ever put out homemade communion bread. You remember that? The fuss? Oh, it was awful. Awful. And to me, that was a good example of this very, very thing, right? People who were so set on that tradition, that dogma, that this is what it's got to be, that when something new, and we didn't do it in a good way. I mean, think about it. I mean, we should have said something, but, I thought it was the most wonderful thing on earth to eat communion bread that a sister in Christ had made, not that we buy from the Jews. I thought that was great, but so many people were just upset. I mean, upset to the point of mad. I mean, they were mad, and that to me is an example right there of a weak Christian as opposed to a strong Christian. A strong Christian might have said, well, they didn't do that right, or well, I was a little surprised. But a strong Christian, it would not have bothered them that bad. It would have been like, this is not a thing. A weak Christian, this is a big thing, right? And a lot of times what you fight in the church is immaturity in Christianity, immaturity in faith. Faith that looks more towards tradition and dogma than it does towards God. And boy, we just got to get away from that. I think that's really what Paul, because if you really look at what Paul's saying, he's talking about food, and he's talking about drink, and he's talking about eating. He's talking about stuff that shouldn't even matter to us as Christians. I mean, it should not matter, right? But yet, you know what happens, right? When our faith is based upon tradition and dogmatic principles, that's what bothers us. If our faith is based upon Christ, that doesn't bother me really at all. But Paul's saying here, he says, you know, eat all things. One who's weak eats vegetables only. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat. The one who does not eat, not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. So the Jew who says, I can't eat bacon, I can't eat pork, even though he's a Christian, right, now, and he should be able to eat whatever he wants, right? But he doesn't eat bacon, doesn't eat pork, because he says, well, I've just never eaten pork. And pork's got to be bad, so if you eat pork, we got a problem. We're not going to eat with you. Stupid, right? But it's not stupid, because that's the kind of things that get under people's skin and drives them nuts. So Paul says, listen to me. Listen. You know? And that's where I think you get into this idea. All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. You know? All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. Right? You know, I always wear a suit on Sundays, and there's a lot of churches anymore where preachers don't. They just wear whatever, shirt, jeans, sweater, right? And, you know, but every Sunday morning, and I'm not a suit wearer, you know. Jay can vouch for that, right? I mean, I never owned suits till I started preaching. I had one suit when I started preaching, right? I mean, I never wore suits, right? But, you know, I think, and of course, maybe not as much now as 10 years ago, but when I started preaching 10 or 11 years ago, you know, people really felt comfortable with that. They just thought that's how a preacher should dress. And so I just thought, well, you know, and I'd have people come in. Well, one of them's dead now, but several of them are dead now. But I'd have people come in and say, it's really tragic, isn't it? And say, well, we went to visit this church. Man, that preacher got up there in a sweater and sat on a stool. And that just really bothered me. You know, he wasn't respecting God, and he should dress up. And so I'm just like, you know, if I wear a suit, everybody's happy, right? I mean, if I come in jeans, most everybody would probably be, well, it doesn't matter, right? But some people would be like, well, I just can't believe he preached on a Sunday morning in jeans. Sunday night might be all right, right? But I just can't believe he preached in a Sunday morning in jeans or something. But to me, it's like, so wear the suit, right? I mean, just wear the suit. Oh, I know. Yeah. Well, I think when I had to get up and actually, you know what I mean? Well, you know, I was the opposite guy of that because, you know, one reason originally, you know, and I'll go back, you know, I can go back 50 years, you know, well, 40 years here now, all right at it. When me and Susie first got married, you know, when we'd come to church here, everybody was so dressed up. I mean, we had the Rileys and even the women, man, it was whole hog, you know. Yeah. And so me and Susie, I didn't even own a suit. You know, I didn't have anything but jeans. That's all I owned, you know. And I just felt uncomfortable. And that's the reason we started going to Walika because, you know, Doyle would come in bib overalls, you know. So, yeah, I'm the anti, you know. And it's funny because I've shifted off of that some, you know, in my older age. Yeah, well, I think, you know, I think when I started preaching, I said, you know, I'm just not going to offend anybody. I'm going to put on a suit. And then, you know, in my mind, I'm thinking, you know, Sunday night worship is no less important to me than Sunday morning worship. You know, so if I'm going to wear a suit on Sunday morning, then I'm just going to wear a suit on Sunday. You know, big deal, right? I mean, just put it on, right? And so I think that is kind of under the same principle. There's some things you can do if it doesn't offend anybody, then just do it, you know? And but I think there's a place you draw the line on that too. And I think you have to draw the line at some point on some of that stuff and say, I don't want to offend you, but let's talk about this because I don't think this should offend you anyway. This should be all right. Not talking about the dress thing. Still up in the air about that. But for the foreseeable future, I probably will wear a suit at the pulpit until I die or until I quit preaching, one or the other. So till they let me go, I'll probably wear a suit at the pulpit. Just saying. But I don't see myself getting in the pulpit with jeans. I don't think that's going to happen. So, but anyway, but that's kind of the idea, right? Why are you to judge the servant of another to his own master? He stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. You got to look beyond little things, and if you feel comfortable, and I guess dress isn't the best example, but it's an easy example, and I really don't care what you wear when you come as long as you're here, so don't take any of this wrong, but if you're comfortable in a suit, then wear a suit. If you're comfortable in jeans and a Western shirt, then wear jeans and a Western shirt. But either way, the guy in the suit shouldn't look at the guy in the jeans and say, oh, well, he should dress up. And the guy in the jeans shouldn't look at the guy in the suit, which often happens today, and say, well, he just makes everybody look bad. He ought to just wear jeans, right? I mean, it doesn't matter. That's what I'm trying to say. It makes no difference. Love each other. If you want to wear a suit, wear a suit. You want to wear jeans, wear jeans. I don't care, right? I don't care. Love each other. If you want to get the cups from the back and take your communion cups, and you want to take the one I don't care, right? Love each other. Stuff makes no difference to me, right? Makes no difference to me. Love each other. Doesn't matter. And I think that's what Paul would say. He'd say, just love each other, and it's okay. That stuff doesn't matter. Don't let it bother you. Yeah, yeah. Who are you to judge the servant of another? Meaning we're servants of God, right? And who's going to judge us? Means we're servants of God, basically, is what he's saying. Who are you to judge the servant of another? We're the servants of God, right? And God's going to judge it. Yeah, 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 Jack. Oh, Pat. Yeah, there you go. Exactly. But I think there's some. I do. I think there's some truth in it. And like Jay said, I've been the anti-dress-up guy since forever. But on the other hand, I think that, and I think that, I don't care if you're a jean. I always only had jeans for years. I didn't even have a pair of slacks or suit. But I always wore my best jeans, and I always wore a good shirt, and I always wore the best of what I had. I didn't dress down to go to church. I mean, I'm not saying you need to dress up to go to church, but I kind of bothers me when people dress down to come to church. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I don't think we ought to wear pajamas to church, and I just think I always tell people, I said, dress up. You ought to dress as nice to come to church as you would to take somebody out or to go out and eat, or why not? Why don't you? Why offend your brothers and sisters? Dress decently and modestly, and if all you got is not great, then we're the best of the not great. I mean, just I don't know. That's kind of how I think. Times have changed. Yeah. Uh-uh. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, or don't be offended by whoever. Don't be offended by the other one. You know, don't. Right. And it's all right, Jack. I don't intend to preach in jeans. Well, yeah, that's kind of what happened with Clyde too. Kind of the same thing. But yeah, times have changed, like Brent says. You know, I remember when I first started coming to church here in the '80s. Most women wore hats. You know, and you don't hardly ever see a hat at church anymore. But it used to be that everything. Every woman had a hat years ago. You know. Yeah. So there's a lot of things to regard a day above another, or every day alike. Each person must be convinced in his own mind. He observes the day, observes it for the Lord. He who eats does it for the Lord. He who gives thanks to God, and he who eats not for the Lord, he does not eat, and gives thanks to God. For not one of us lives for himself, and not one dies for himself. For if we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord. So Paul says, love each other, get along, right? Don't sweat the small stuff. Choose the hill you wish to die on. There's a lot of different things I can say. Yeah, go ahead. Right, right. Yeah, of course, there he's talking a lot about Sabbath too. The idea. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Boy, imagine me coming into the church first Christmas. Imagine me coming into a little church in Walika first Christmas and there was nothing. And I grew up, that was a huge thing. Yeah, it was a huge thing. Yeah, he's talking about the old compared to the new, new law, old law, Jewish, Christians. Absolutely. It all transpires. Hmm. Right, there's a lot of parallels for us in it. I know. But I think the big thing when you read it is the big thing when you read it, the overall theme really though, is that you just need to love each other. And those little things, don't make little things big things. Just love each other, and unless it's a big doctrinal matter, we need to just let it go. That's it. Yep. Yep. Thanks for your time this evening.